Welcome back to World History. Today we're going to pick up the story where we left off after the Ming Dynasty declined with the rise of the Qing Dynasty, one of the longest lived and most important dynasties in Chinese history. So here are your objectives for today. Analyze the effects of the Manchurian conquest, explain the ways the Qinglong Emperor changed China's interactions with foreigners, and explain the factors that led to the decline of the Qing Dynasty in the 1700s. So without further ado, let's dive in. As we hopefully remember from last time, the Ming Dynasty declined because their emperors stopped focusing on governance and instead focused on tomb building and banqueting, which led to flooding and a series of issues. And so the Qing Dynasty, or the Ming Dynasty, was overthrown by a coup from a powerful general, which made it very easy for a group called the Manchurians, who were a group of sort of formerly nomadic, what the Chinese would have considered barbarians, to invade and conquer China without much opposition. The Manchurians were in some ways similar to the Chinese, but had some very different cultural practices that they forced everyone in China to adopt. For example, the Qing Dynasty demanded that all Chinese men adopt this specific hairstyle by which they shave the front of their head and then grow this long ponytail called a queue down the back. And so this was one way that the Manchurians forced the Chinese to adopt Manchurian customs. They also, of course, much like the Mongols had before them, favored Manchurian candidates for government posts. This favoring of Manchurians, you would think, would cause a lot of resentment in China, but the early years of the Manchurian conquest and the Qing Dynasty were so effective that they entrenched Manchurian rule and led to a very long-lived and successful dynasty. Much of the success of the early Qing Dynasty can be chalked up to its first emperor, the Kangxi Emperor. He, of course, did all the things that successful emperors do. He revived again the examination system, which had fallen into disrepair and disuse in the later years of the Qing Dynasty. He again repaired and rebuilt the Grand Canal in order to stop some of the devastating flooding that had been happening previously. And in a massive departure from the Ming Dynasty emperors who had just lived in the Forbidden City, the Kangxi Emperor went on a massive journey all across China in order to assess what the problems were in local areas and then try to solve them. This made the Kangxi Emperor seem like he cared about the plight of the common people, which helped solidify the Manchurian rule over the ethnically Han Chinese population. This success led to massive population growth in China as a combination of new crops, specifically new crops from the Americas, which we'll start talking about next unit, and new farming techniques led the Chinese population to begin to skyrocket. You can see clearly here the growth of China's population under the Qing Dynasty, which of course significantly increases China's ability to produce products and become wealthy through trade. This massive wealth of trade really expanded under the Qinglong Emperor, who we see pictured down here. It was during this time period that China became more completely integrated into the global trade system that had really picked up during the European Age of Exploration, which again we'll talk about next unit. European companies like the Dutch East India Company and later the English East India Company began to show up with new trade goods, trying to open up trade with China. Unfortunately for these Europeans, China had no interest in Western trade goods and instead demanded payments in gold and silver in order for Europeans to get the tea, the porcelain, and the silk that they wanted. And so the end result of this is unbelievable amounts of silver start flowing into China. All of this silver makes the Qinglong Emperor's reign one of the wealthiest periods in Chinese history. All of this wealth allows the Qinglong Emperor to partake in massive building projects, including the famous Summer Palace, in Nanjing, which we see pictured here. But all of this foreign contact was starting to worry the Chinese as new ideas were starting to spread, and the Chinese were worried that foreign influences would profoundly change their society. And so the Qinglong Emperor started up this new system of trade called the Canton system, which restricted the Europeans to one port at a place that the Europeans called Canton and is today very close to Hong Kong and Guangzhou. Europeans were only allowed within this one single port, where they would then have to pass their goods off to Chinese merchants in order to distribute them. Also, in order to trade, European emissaries would have to come and perform the kowtow bowing ritual before Chinese imperial authority in order to be allowed to trade even at this one restricted port. But for most European nations, the Chinese goods, especially tea, was so profitable and so sought after that they were very willing to bow before the Chinese emperors in order to get access to these incredibly valuable markets. One notable exception to this was the British emissary, Lord Macartney, refused to bow before the Chinese emperor, and the British were then completely banned from trading with China. But despite all the good that happened in the early part of the Qianlong Emperor's reign, he ruled for, quite frankly, too long. And in his latter half of his years, he handed off power to a man named He Shen, who we see depicted here, who ended up being one of the most corrupt officials in Chinese history. Rather than using all the money coming in for building projects that would make people's lives better or defending China from its enemies, instead He Shen pocketed most of it and spent it on lavish ceremonies and palaces for himself, which led to the prerequisite failures of the dams, which led to flooding, which then led to famine and rebellion. And in the latter half of the Qianlong Emperor's reign, we see all the hallmarks of a dynasty potentially falling apart, mostly because the Qianlong Emperor, again, retreated in order to enjoy the last years of his life, leaving corrupt people in charge. This led to a massive rebellion in the later 1700s known as the White Lotus Rebellion, which did not end the Qing Dynasty, but did significantly weaken it and played a role in all the things that are going to happen to China in the 1800s. But all of that is a story for another time, as we'll return to the Qing Dynasty sometime second semester. So the White Lotus Rebellion was eventually put down, but as you can see here, 16 million people died, and it was incredibly devastating. So this brings us back to our three objectives. Hopefully you can provide reasonable answers to all three of these. And when we come back, we're going to move further east to some islands off the coast to talk a little bit about the history of Japan.